All right, welcome back. Matt here. Today, let's talk trees. I wanted to first of all talk about a couple of different potential pipelines you can use to do foliage and trees in Unreal Engine, and I wanted to kind of walk you through a couple different ways to use the kind of pipeline we've settled on here. So, I've got a ton to cover. This is probably going to be an hour-long video. I apologize, but let's just kind of get right into it. So, there are a couple ways to generate trees in terms of meshes. You can straight model one in your 3D program or 3D modeling program of choice. I've done it before in Blender. That works. It can be a little hard. It can be especially hard to do levels of detail, and it can be extremely hard to get kind of your poly counts and get the look just right. There are a lot of better options. Another way is to use plugins for 3D modeling software. Blender has a plugin called Sapling, which I think ships with it and seems to be updated, which will let you generate trees just fine. If you can afford it, SpeedTree is kind of what the pro scene uses. I think it's $20 a month. If you're cheap or broke like me, then you can also use a piece of software, and this is the one we've settled on, called TreeIt. Oops, I just opened Chrome. TreeIt's great. It's got really generous licensing terms, any models and assets you use, free to use with any engine, commercial or otherwise. So I'm not going to show you necessarily how to use the Sapling plugin for Blender or how to model it yourself. I'll just show you how to use TreeIt here. We're going to kind of walk through two different things you can do. This is not going to show how to do real hyperrealism in trees. I mean, this doesn't look bad in terms of a realistic tree model. Foliage is hard, though, and if you want to do really realistic forests, if you want to build Crisis, then you're going to have a very advanced understanding of kind of the lighting engine. We're far past what I have. So keep that in mind. I'll show you some ways to kind of cheat, get things looking good, get them mostly optimized. If at all possible, instead of doing things realistically, I'd recommend finding nice stylized ways to do them. I'll also show you this little stylized shader I've done in the background there, which I think is pretty good. So let me just walk you through TreeIt really quick. If you open it up, it'll look like this. You can save, rotate, you can get a top, front, side, or perspective view. You can show wireframe, you can show vertex colors, which I'll talk about. Turn wind on and off. Wind is not going to export from this program. You're going to have to build that either in Engine. You might be able to pull it from vertex colors. One of the options here is to have vertex colors export wind data. I have not experimented with this. If you want wind to happen other than just on the leaf material itself, for example, this actually will bend the tree back and forth, you may be able to get that through vertex colors. Lighting on and off, grid on and off, render to texture. Let's talk a little bit about levels of detail and what that means. Normally, levels of detail in Engine, the farther away you get from an object, the fewer polygons it really needs to render because the less detail you can actually see. This is especially important with foliage because foliage is pretty expensive shader-wise. It's also particularly difficult with foliage because Unreal can automatically reduce detail on a static mesh, but it'll pull these leaves around, remove some entirely, and so you'll notice this really obnoxious pop-in. I'm sure you've played games that have this where foliage really kind of suddenly changes when you approach it. So it's really difficult to get levels of detail right on trees. So generally you have, the way we're going to do it is by trying to change the silhouette as little as possible. So you'll have a full level of detail, you'll have a level of detail that mostly changes like the number of sides the cylinder is used for the branches, the sub-branches. That can reduce polys by a lot. You'll have a third level of detail that reduces them even further and reduces the trunk. We're just going to leave, we're not going to touch leaves. You can do that, especially if you've got a kind of dithered approach to levels of detail. It might not look so bad if you're really careful about how you make changes, or if you make those changes in your own 3D modeling program rather than trying to just reduce leaf counts, then you may have better luck. The fourth level of detail, the final one that is usually what's called a billboard. When you get to a certain distance, this tree doesn't really need to be a model. It can just be a flat sprite because you just aren't going to notice any depth other than in the silhouette. So you can basically take the tree and render it out into a texture, and that texture is just applied to one literal plane in the background at a certain distance. This can be difficult, especially because you can imagine that the lighting wouldn't quite work correctly. I've got lighting coming in from this direction, and so I could do my texture in such a way that lights it correctly, but then if I move around to this direction, now the light is coming in the wrong way. There are complicated ways you can fix this problem. I'm not gonna, I'll tell you about them, but I won't actually demonstrate them here. The easy ways are to either just acknowledge that that's going to be a problem and that your very distant trees are going to be lit slightly from the wrong direction. Not a big deal at all if you've got static lighting, especially if that static lighting is coming in at a high angle. You're not really going to notice it. You can even have it, the other way to do it is just to have your far off trees be unlit and not have any shadow detail. It's not going to be too bad. If you have a lot of trees very far off, you may need a better approach. But those are two ways you can deal with it without having to get into the complex stuff. Okay, so our goal then is to generate, let's say, 3 levels of detail and a texture that we can use on a billboard. In TreeIt, you've got a lot of options. I'm not going to walk you through all of them. You have tree-wide options, things like how you've generated it. You can give it a random seed. You can do poly reduction on the tree itself, on the trunk, the branches, or the leaves. And this is just an attempt to reduce the number of polys, which you can see down here. Good tree usually will have 5,000-6,000 max, even up close. You know, depending on your needs, you can go higher, you can go lower, whatever. Rotation, scaling, you can change the. Oops, I've accidentally just changed it myself. Scaling in X, Y, and Z, just globally. An important thing to note here is that you can look at trunk joints, and if you select a joint, you can export this by just breaking it. If you wanted to, say, have trees that you could cut down, this is where you can do it. TreeIt allows you to generate a material, and it'll do UVs for the top. So you could, say, pick your joint that you want as the trunk. I might want the trunk there, break it, export this. You can hit this little checkbox to invert that for the top part, and export this again, and then you do some logic in game that says when I chop it down, it replaces the one tree mesh with these two, and then tips this one over. So that's a good way to do it. Oops, I need to invert that and stop editing. Okay. You've also got trunk settings specifically. You can do a texture or 2 textures. 2 textures would be if you wanted to blend them. The most common example of this would be if I wanted some snow on the bottom of the tree, because snow is collected on the ground and at the base of the trunk, but not so much at the top. So I might pick a bark texture here. I think bark 4 has snow on it, and then you pick the texture that it'll put on end caps for breaking the tree. Not a big deal if you're just going to have the regular tree, but I'll put one in anyway. So now you notice that because I put 2 textures in, it has blended them so that there's a little snowy bit at the bottom, and you can control the amount and the location of that blend up here. It's common for you to want to have like split trunk trees, so you can split them into 2, 3, 4. I don't know, if you want 1 billion trunks, you can do that too. We'll just stick with 1. Sides. This trunk is generated as a kind of segmented cylinder. Sides is the number of sides that cylinder has, and segments is the number of segments up this way. Sides is the primary way we're going to reduce detail in the lower levels of detail. Trunk size, length, radius, curvature. You can do crinkliness and bend amounts and specify which axes you want it to bend in, and twist as it goes up. You notice that it kind of twists around counterclockwise here. You can control how much of that happens. You can flare the base. Let's see, we might do flare it by 3, that kind of thing. If you want to do that, that's basically it. Branches. You can control the number of them. I might. This is also the primary source of polygons for the tree. The leaves are actually going to be surprisingly low. You have regular branches, which have a number of sides, a number of segments, poly reduction amount, and then you have branchlets, which are going to spawn on the edges of these. So I might want 24 of those. And you notice that I went from 500 polygons to almost 4,000. So this really is a primary source. You have the same sort of settings as with the trunk: radius, crinkliness, bends, twists, that kind of thing. You can, especially for split trunk trees, you might want to more specify what angles these branches and branchlets are allowed to be at, but for this is all fine. Roots. I wouldn't put roots on trees unless they are set pieces, basically. If you wanted a specific tree that looked like it had fallen over, you would probably want roots at the bottom of that. Trees that were kind of coming out of the ground a little bit, just know that you can generate them, but that you don't usually have to if they're just regular forest trees. Finally, leaves. Leaves are the complex part. By default, if I take my leaves layer and I load a texture in, all these textures are going to be little bitty individual leaves. I can do that, and then I can up the count, and you'll notice that it just puts like a bunch of individual leaves. This is designed for things like if you want to do a pre-rendered cutscene or movie or something, then you're not so concerned about things like this poly count. But in a game, you really want these to be bigger sheets that each have a bunch of little leaves. Those aren't going to be available in this list, but you can load them from presets. TreeIt has a bunch of tree presets, and so if I wanted oak tree, oak leaf texture, and each of these leaf presets comes with a texture, a normal map, a specularity map, and a subsurface scattering map. So they're great things to start from here. So, I'd have to sit here and load each one of these, which I'm not going to do, but you notice now that these are a little better. And both in TreeIt and in Unreal, you may notice that the leaves come in and they're rotated the wrong way. These should really be facing like 90 degrees offset. You may have to then pull this into your 3D modeling program of choice and rotate those UVs just to get it looking correct. One thing I recommend, instead of doing this yourself, is to work from a preset. Just come here to open, pick one of these that's going to be pretty similar. Oak trees are like pretty standard trees, and these will be kind of pre-generated, and you can play with these settings rather than starting from scratch. For example, I want to be able to walk under my little oak tree, so I could take my branches and I can change the distribution. Or can I? I think this is a pre-generated. And you can regenerate them that way. Regardless, this is a good way to get your leaves set up. This uses two sets of leaves. You can specify where they're spawned, whether they're spawned on the little branchlets at the very tips, or whether they're spawned on the branches themselves or on the trunk. There are some cases if you wanted like an evergreen where you might want them to be spawned on the trunk, and then it all depends on what your leaf texture kind of looks like. So this uses two layers, one spawned on branchlets and one spawned on branches, just to give a little bit of internal depth here. You can also set some colors if you wanted to blend in your own colors. This is especially good if you wanted some nice fall trees, that kind of thing. You can right click to clear those. Color intensity, shade intensity, all these are kind of self-explanatory. One thing is going to be cross-section, which you can't change with this preset, but by default it's going to generate these flat planes, which are kind of bent. You may want to generate a kind of cross plane or a cross plane with a front. So play with these settings, play with the counts, distributions. They've got the same sort of settings you'd expect: length, width, size. You can play with wind, although the wind is just going to be in TreeIt. Okay. Now that we've looked at this, what I'm going to do is take this and I'm going to export it in a couple different ways here, just to show you how these levels of detail might work. So this, 6100 tries, maybe a little high, that'll be okay. So I'm going to export this straight up. You can export as FBX. You didn't used to be able to do this. I'll just throw it on desktop and I'll overwrite my oak. For the first level of detail, the first bit we move away, I'm going to remove some of the branch detail. I don't want to touch the leaf silhouette, and I don't really want to touch the trunk because that might be pretty obvious. So I'll just take branch and I'll reduce the number of sides, say down to 7, and the branchlets down to 5. And bam, I'm already down almost 1200 tries. And that's, nothing. It doesn't even really change much of the detail except for up close. So I'll re-export this, just New Oak 2 as another one, and then my third level of detail, I'm only going to do 3 before the billboard, and I'm not actually going to do the billboard just to save on some time here, but I would probably take branches, crank them all the way down, because we're losing that branch detail anyway. Take the trunk, lower its number of segments down to like 11, maybe 12. Most of the trunk's not really responsible for a lot of polys, and bam, we've shaved off another 1200. And I will export this as New Oak 3. And then you're going to render to texture. You can hit this, you can change background color, change your texture size. You're probably going to want to go to like front view first, get this set up just the way you want it. If you want to render to texture with lighting, you may just have to literally screenshot this, because the render to texture is going to remove that lighting information anyway. I'll talk a little bit about the advanced method, and if you want to do that, then you're going to want to render this to texture anyway. Ideally, you'll want to render it to texture in such a way that it fills up as much of the screen as possible. Something like, zoom in, really get it as close as you kind of can. That looks pretty good, so that it fills more of it. Anyway, I'm not actually going to do that. One trick here is that this is going to export as an ASCII FBX, and if I pull up Blender and I try to import one of those, it's not going to like it. It refuses to import ASCII FBX files. If you're using a different modeling software, this might not be a problem. You can open it in really anything that will open it and then resave it, and this should be fine. Windows 10 ships with Paint 3D, so I can go to my desktop where I saved these, and I can take my New Oak and I can edit with Paint 3D. Not bother to import textures, and then literally resave this out, and then I'll be able to open it in Blender. This may produce some weird things. It may rotate it because the axes have shifted. It may scale it, so you're going to want to take it into Blender, get everything set up just the way you want it, fix the UVs on the leaves so they're rotated correctly. If you don't need to make any edits, then you may not even need to worry about that. Unreal will import those files just fine. So what I'm going to do is, excuse me, I'm going to import this static mesh from my desktop. It was called New Oak. The only real settings you have to worry about, we don't need to really play with vertex colors or anything. You're going to want to hit this combine meshes, because TreeIt's going to export the leaves and the trunk as separate meshes. We're not importing LODs. You do want to import normals, because it's going to set those up in a way that does smoothing pretty well. This is going to be different when we do our stylized one, and I'll show you that when we get there. Nothing too fancy with transform, don't need to convert scene, don't need to import materials, we'll just do that. And here we are. This is our tree. I'm going to go ahead and throw the materials I've already got in Engine here, just so we can kind of get a look at it. And these are not going to be great or anything by any means, but hey, we've got an oak tree, and the leaves are rotated correctly, and it's all good. So, how do we do levels of detail? Levels of detail are based on screen size. If I get close, 1 being like a 100% screen size, it will automatically compute the screen size at which it will transition. It's not going to do a very good job. So we're going to do this ourselves. Under LODs here, LOD settings, LOD import, you can import LOD1. And then we're just going to go to where we saved it, take our LOD and import it. And the same with LOD level 2. And it will import those. And then we're going to uncheck auto compute LOD distances, because it doesn't do a very good job. Note that it will give you warnings when you build lighting if you try to use different shadow information or different light map information for different LODs. I've tried in the past, for example, to have, say, the trunk not bother to cast shadows at low LODs because the leaves are going to provide a good enough silhouette anyway, and it doesn't throw an error or anything, but it will warn you about it. So we are going to cast shadows and all that jazz. We're not going to bother to do any like normal recomputing or anything. Let's get the LODs set up. So we pick LOD 0, and we decide what kind of threshold we want to transition to it at. Maybe 0.3 looks pretty good. So screen size 0.3. LOD 1 we'll transition away from at, and I may be doing this in the wrong order. Let's say 0.2 just for fun. And then LOD 1, or excuse me, LOD 2, yeah, 0.1, whatever. So now if I go back to LOD auto, you can see screen size, you can see the level of detail I'm on and the number of tries. You notice that when I cross this threshold, I go from LOD 2, which is only 3,700 tries, to LOD 1, which is almost 5,000. And then if I really get close and I cross 0.2, I did actually do this in the wrong order, by the way, but it doesn't matter. Then I'm going to cross to LOD 0. And you notice that you don't actually notice any pop-in. And that's because we haven't changed. There's some settings you don't want to change. Anything that's going to affect this kind of silhouette. So you don't want to change your trunk segments. That's going to affect the silhouette. You don't want to change your branch segments. You don't want to do poly reduction on your branches. You can do these things, especially if you have a dithered LOD stuff set up. But most of the detail is not in the leaves, it's in the branches anyway. So you're going to get most of your... there's only 1,200 leaf polygons, and in this low level of detail, there's still 2,000 branch polygons. So this is going to produce some smooth transitions between levels of detail. If you're too aggressive with the sides on the trunk, you may notice that becomes a little bit of pop-in at close LODs. Still not a big deal. Another thing is that if you notice that your branches are being lit, aren't being lit smoothly, you notice the seams in lighting, you may have not imported normals but recomputed them. So I would re-import your mesh in that case. Another thing that you probably should check on import is to tell it to not auto-generate collision. If so, you can just delete it. It will do a poor job. Most of the time you don't want to collide with all of the tree, you just want to collide with the trunk. So we can say add a capsule collision here, hold R and scale that right down, and then just kind of eyeball it, you know, as tall as you reasonably want it to be. That looks pretty good. You may want to rotate it. That's too much hassle. So there we go. There's our tree. The fourth level of detail, you're going to have to change these, excuse me, the material sections. And it will recognize that you do that because it will, your final level of detail will only have one material slot, which you'll have to specify. Note that you can use lower texture resolutions in low levels of detail. We're not really going to bother with that. One thing you may consider changing is light map resolution, because if you have a large forest, the expensive part of all this is light map resolution, or lighting rather. So finally, to get these trees up and working, you can just drag them out into the world, and bam, we've got a tree. It's a little small, but that's okay. And it will build correctly and all that jazz. But if you want a lot of trees, you want to do it with the foliage tool, because it's going to use instanced static meshes. So we just take it over here and we drag the static mesh in here. I'm going to uncheck these and check this one. And then you have some settings you can play with. Density, let's see, I think, yeah, setting of like 2 or 5 is probably okay. These are copied over from my last one. I've scaled it up a whole bunch. Z offsets, angles that it can adjust. One thing that you're going to want to do, you probably want this static. Even if you're doing trees you can cut down, what you would want to do is run like a hit test and then replace the one, or delete the one that you cut down and replace it with the 2 sections, that kind of thing. Unlike grass, you probably don't want to actually cull away trees. You want to do the kind of billboarding. You probably do want them to cast shadows. Depending on whether your sun moves or not, you may or may not need static or dynamic. To get more efficient rendering of trees, and this is something you'll have to read about, Unreal can use distance fields to do shadows and ambient occlusion. For trees, this will be a more efficient way of lighting them at long distances, but you will sacrifice a little bit of blobbiness up close. You're probably going to want to check this if you're doing anything like a forest or more than a couple trees. You can override light map resolutions, you can set their collision presets, and you can tell them to affect or not affect nav meshes. If you have AI that needs to view trees as obstacles, another thing you might want to do is go into the static mesh properties here, and way down under navigation you can set it to be a dynamic obstacle, which means that it won't try to generate nav mesh like on top, and it'll be a little faster to place into the level. But now if I've got this checked in the foliage tool, I can paint these on my landscape, and it'll do fine. Let me show you how I've got that material set up, because the leaf material is the one you really probably care about. There's a little bit of consideration here, and this is where it gets a little bit maybe unrealistic. I find oftentimes that when you do trees that the self-shadowing is obnoxious. It makes really dark patches where they shouldn't be. You can fix these problems by getting the ambient occlusion settings just right, getting your subsurface stuff correct. I don't really need perfect lighting. I'm kind of going for a stylized look anyway, so I'll pull up the leaf material, and instead of making you look at this mess, we'll try to kind of rebuild it here. So I'm going to make a new material called leaves matte. And let's see, what are we going to need? We're going to need, I'm using the leaf material straight from TreeIt. I promise it's not so hard to make your own, and you can find your own either by just Googling around. CG Textures is a great resource. You don't have to have a specularity map. You don't have to have a subsurface scattering map. You probably do want a normal map if you're going for kind of real leaves, but you can generate a normal map from a diffuse map as well. I'm just going to go ahead and drag all these in. And, you know, we've got specularity, which goes there. We've got normal, which is going to go into normal. We've got subsurface, which is going to go there. And we have base color, which will go here. Now, this doesn't look at anything like correct right now because we have some material modes to kind of set up here. This material is going to be a masked material. I talked about this a little bit in my grass video, but basically you can have opaque materials like this ground that don't have any translucency, very cheap to render. You can have translucent materials, which can have anywhere between like full opaque and fully translucent. If you wanted something like partially translucent glass, then it can be a little bit translucent. Masked materials are great because they can have both translucent and opaque things, and the parts that are opaque are pretty basically as cheap as anything else to render. So you get a lot of efficiency that way. Great for when you have to draw a lot of kind of partially translucent layers on top of each other, like grass. The trade-off is that you either get full translucency or no translucency, nothing in between. Something like this map. So you either get white or black. So this is going to be a masked material. You can have it be default lit. You can have it be subsurface profile or subsurface lit. We're going to use two-sided foliage model. It's basically subsurface, and we are going to set this to be two-sided. And then I'm going to take the alpha of this base texture and plug that into opacity mask. And you can see that, well, we get a pretty good leaf texture, and I can hold L and click to drag the light around, and you can see that some of it gets through from the other side, so that subsurface is doing its job. If I go and I apply this right now, and then I pull up my static mesh and take my new leaf material and plug that in here, you'll notice what I'm talking about. I'm going to have to rebuild here because these are using old versions. In fact, they're still using old versions. Instead of using the foliage tool, I'll just drag it in. If I build, You notice that it already isn't great or anything. We may not find it, but I found that I tended to get some obnoxious self-shadowing spots. And so if you have the same problem, I'll show you how to kind of avoid that in the material. Give it just a moment here. Yeah, see how bad that is? It's just so shaded. So a couple things we can do. One would be to boost the subsurface so that the self-shadowing is less. And this is something you can actually do with the normal and the specularity, is literally just multiply them by holding M and clicking, if it'll let me. There it is. By holding S and clicking, get a scalar parameter. And I might call this subsurface amount. For things like the normal map or the specularity, you might want to then clamp this. I'm actually just going to globally boost this by something like 1.5. And that'll help a little bit. In my material, I've changed these so that you can boost the specular or normal if you want, or remove it if you wanted less normal detail, that kind of thing. Another thing is that foliage tends to be really hard to match with the environment. It's rare that you're going to pull a leaf texture in and it'll just work. So the general way I like to do this is to have a desaturation. And by default, this will make it grayscale, but we're going to multiply it by this fraction. And that's going to control how much of the original color gets through. The fully desaturated version of this has all the detail of the original base texture, but with none of the color. So we're going to default this to 0 and assume that you just want to use the flat texture. And then I'm also going to take the output of that, and I'm actually not going to multiply, I'm going to hold L for lerp. And we're going to lerp between that and hold V for vector parameter. And, you know, I'll just default this to like some green. So between the original texture, or the desaturated version of the texture, and this color, by some alpha, which is just going to be another scalar called tint amount. And keep in mind once again that you can use these groups and sort priorities to get the material instance to be organized just the way you want. But we'll plug this in and it won't look any different, but it'll let us tweak it on the fly, which is all we really want. Excuse me. The other fancy thing we're going to do is there's not really an option in Unreal Engine to take a mesh and tell it to not self-shadow. It just doesn't really exist. The way that we can cheat that is by taking this base texture and plugging some of it back into emissive color. And that's going to be color that, you know, pretends to be emitting light, and so it's not going to be affected by the shadow. So I can take a multiply node and take another scalar parameter and say emissive amount, and you want this to be small, somewhere maybe 0.1 is pretty good. Plug that into emissive color, and we're already making a mess in here. And this will just basically cheat the system by preventing it from self-shadowing so much. So that's already better. What I can do, let's see, we'll add the last component, which is going to be wind. Same as with grass, we're going to use the simple grass wind node, plug that straight into world position offset, and use some more scalars. I'm not going to bother to name these, I'll just plug them in and give them some numbers. I assume you know what the deal is at this point. Oh no, I don't want you to be the same one. Point 2, 0.5. I'm just using some values I found that work okay. Okay, and this will just kind of wave it around a little bit to mimic wind. And this won't be the same kind of wind that you got in TreeIt, where it actually waves the branches back and forth. It'll just be on this leaf material. Last thing we're going to want to do is take that and make a material instance out of it, and then use that in our static mesh. Because now what we can do is take this material instance, and this is what I was talking about with groups. They're all grouped into scalar parameter values, and you can change that if you want. But I can take desaturation, pull it up to 0.1, maybe take tint amount and 0.3. Make this a nicer kind of yellow. Take the, this one's just named none. Oh, this is all wind. Subsurface amount, but you can see that it already looks quite a bit better. And if I actually built lighting, then it would do shadowing a little bit better here. So that's how I'm kind of cheating the system to get lighting that looks okay. And these will generate trees that are pretty good. And if you're going for any kind of stylized look, then this will be fine. Let me talk briefly, very briefly, about how to do that billboarding with correct lighting. You notice this material has a little node called pixel depth offset. Unreal Engine allows you to specify like a texture here that basically corresponds to this one and provides depth information. And what it'll do in the case of this like tree billboard is it'll render the billboard with the regular old texture, but for purposes of shadowing and ambient occlusion, it'll kind of push and pull every pixel in it by an amount you specify in here. So if you had an actual depth map of the tree, then you could have a 2D billboard that's unlit, pushed around by that depth map, and then it'll actually light correctly in the background. And the way you can generate one of those, I've got a forum post where one of the technical artists at Unreal or at Epic chimes in on how they do this. They did this in the old Kite demo back in version 4.8, I think. Excuse me again. But if you go to View Options here in the Content Browser and you enable Engine Content, and then I go and look at it, under Art Tools, Render to Texture Blueprints, there is a Render to Texture pawn, and you can use this to take one of these, use like the Render Imposter thing, and you can render out a version of it, literally render scene objects to a texture. You can render out a depth map. And then you can plug that. You have to be a little bit careful about the levels because the kind of depth and lighting has changed in the engine since then, but you can pull that into your material, multiply it by some constant, and get pixel depth offset, and that will do correct lighting in the background. If you're willing to go that far anyway. So, okay, that's how you do kind of standard trees with standard levels of detail. You notice the tiniest bit of pop in if I really move fast here, but it really is not bad. And these are relatively efficient trees, and you can pop a couple hundred of them down and you'll have really no problems. The other thing I want to really quickly cover is just how I did these stylized ones. It is a combination of kind of three sort of competing effects. And I'll show you, I was kind of inspired a little bit by, I was looking around at this self-shadowing for foliage problem, and I found this old Reddit post on the Unreal Engine Reddit where someone was coming from Unity and trying to generate a shader like this. And basically what it does is they use these trees that look kind of like, let me actually open one in TreeIt here. Let's see. Look like this, with these kind of like cross planes in in the actual mesh. And then they're trying to eliminate these kind of obnoxious shadows where you see these cross planes intersecting each other by literally culling them away, by fading them out of existence when you hit a certain angle. So I've got a shader that does this. You notice that if I look front on, then it's here, and if I move over to the side, then it will fade away. And that helps a little bit. It's not quite enough on its own. The other things that I've done are, I originally took this texture that was, minimize everything, one I found online. In the final iteration of this, I'll have my own, obviously, but took this, blurred it, played with the luminosity, basically so that when you intersect two of them, if I take one of these and I push another one out and then push it back a little bit, you don't, and I'll push it back even further, you don't necessarily, other than for shadowing reasons, see them as separate cards. It doesn't have a really defined edge, because the color is pretty consistent throughout. And that's design part 2. Design part 3 is once again using that pixel depth offset. You notice that if I pull this one forward in space that it like pokes through the other one, even though it's still pretty obviously behind it. And that's because I literally am running a noise texture over the whole thing, multiplied by some silly number like 120, and running that into pixel depth offset. And so it lights it and does shadowing as if it were kind of much noisier, much more kind of volumetric than a single plane. And the combination of these three effects produces these, you know, stylized trees. I'm not totally happy with how the edges still cull away. That kind of comes down to the mesh itself and having either more leaves or having it so that the silhouette, there's kind of redundancy in the silhouette, would help that a little bit. But especially in packs or in far distance stuff, I think it really looks okay. I'll show you the actual shader here. The way I'm doing that culling effect, where it culls away if I get to the right angle, is I need to compare the angle of the actual surface normal in world space, and I need to get the difference between that angle and the angle that I'm looking at it from, the camera angle. So to get the angle of my camera, I take camera position minus world position, and that gets me a vector from the world position of the pixel we're looking at to the camera. I normalize that, so I get a unit vector, which is just a direction. And then this is going to be a little bit of vector math. I take the dot product of that with the actual surface normal of that pixel. You could like do some shenanigans with arc cosine and get the actual angle if you wanted to actually know and cull it away at like 80 degrees or something. The dot product I found was enough for me. It kind of produces just a value between 0 and 1 that works pretty well as alpha. If I plug this straight into, not opacity mask, it's opacity mask, and then I'm adding in the alpha of the actual texture itself. What you'll see once it updates here is that it clips away when I get to a certain angle. So that's the effect of comparing those normals and then using the dot product of them as opacity mask. Now, this is kind of a hard clip. A trick you can use when you want kind of feathered masking like this is to run it through this dithered temporal anti-aliasing. I'm not going to go into it too much, but temporal anti-aliasing is an anti-aliasing method that kind of blurs edges by comparing them over multiple frames. So it kind of is a good way to cheat blurriness or kind of dithering. This random value just controls how strong that is. So now if I plug this in, then you get the same thing, but it kind of feathers it instead of going at once, which helps a little bit. Just got parameters for like roughness and specular, and then we're doing the same thing as the other ones where we're plugging some of it back into emissive color so that we reduce self-shadowing. Same nonsense with wind, and then this is what I was talking about with the depth offset. You notice if I look at the back that it looks like weirdly offset in terms of shadow information. And that's because I'm just taking this tiling noise texture from the engine, multiplying it by some obscene number, and then plugging that in. And that basically reduces the strength of these little like intersections because it's shadowing it as if it was all over the place. So it kind of makes it a little more volumetric. So if you wish to copy this, feel free, iterate on it. It is not perfect by any means, and note that it'll work really well with the cell shader that I've been touting for a while. And it also helps. You'll have to tweak parameters. I've taken like ambient occlusion, and in this case dropped it all the way down. That's what it would look like with regular ambient occlusion, which is still fine, but you see a little bit of these cross planes, lowering the intensity to like half of what it was, or removing it altogether. And the cell shader works much better if you remove ambient occlusion anyway. Kind of helps it a little bit. So that's my little stylized look. The final iteration of this, I think I'll have some more detail in the leaves, as long as the colors and the textures overlap in such a way that it's not really obvious when one's in front of another, then it'll work pretty well. So those are a couple approaches, a couple kind of pipelines to do trees and foliage. Hopefully you enjoyed. I know this was a really long one, but be sure to follow us if you want to see more. I think we'll be doing some shenanigans with particle effects soon, and got some tutorials coming that way. So thank you for sitting through this long video. I'll see you next time.